Okay, everyone. I'm not surprised to see the places packed out for this. Technology is a powerful tool that has concentrated enormous power in the hands of a few. It takes good leadership to ensure technology is working for everyone and not just those few. Please welcome CNN's senior technology correspondent, Laurie Segall, and two giants of the political and tech worlds, President of Microsoft, Brad Smith, and former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Tony Blair.
Great to be sitting here with you guys, especially at this time in tech. I want to start with a basic question. You hear everyone at Web Summit talking about how we navigate uncharted territory. We need new values for the tech sector. You know, what is the first step that we need to do to make sure this isn't just lip service? It's obviously a complicated time in tech.
Well, I think we're rapidly entering an era where people and societies and governments are holding tech companies accountable. And you see the press doing that. You see governments starting to do that. I don't think it hurts to be held accountable. People have been awakening, I think, in the tech sector to the issues of the day. But a little pressure usually keeps people on their toes, and that's not a bad thing.
Right. And go ahead.
I think it's the single biggest challenge is to make the policymakers and the change makers understand each other. Because, you know, I always say to people, politicians are very kind of simple folk. If they don't understand something, they tend to be against it. So there's a revolution going on in technology, and it's going to change every aspect of the way we live and work and think. And the political debate really hasn't caught up with that. So there's issues around regulation, but there's also issues around how you access the opportunities of tech, because there's amazing opportunities in healthcare, in energy, in reforming systems. And it's also a tremendous challenge for business. How does it prepare for digitalization? You know, what are the changes that business makes? And then how do we educate people for a world that's going to be completely different, and educate people throughout life and not just as children? So I think the policy questions are huge, and yet I still feel that the political debate around technology hasn't moved dramatically from the time that I was Prime Minister, when, you know, as Prime Minister of the UK, you kind of have health policy, education policy, defense policy, law and order policy, and then you'd have technology. Whereas today, technology really disrupts and affects and influences all of these different spheres. And I don't think we've really geared the political debate up to the scale of the challenge. So that is what I think is the issue of the moment. And it's not just a question of regulation. Of course it's right. You've got to hold the companies to account. But I think there's a much bigger set of policy issues that arise from the interrelationship between technology and public policy.
You've been kind of at the forefront of talking to the administration, making changes at Microsoft. What are you stewing on right now? What ethical issue requires regulation? What is an area that you think we really need more regulation on, that people aren't maybe necessarily paying attention to, that will become a very big problem?
Well, first of all, I would just build on what you just heard. I think it's a really good insight just to reflect on the fact that, say, over the last 20 years, technology has been moving quickly and government in this space has been moving slowly. And for many years, people in technology, I think, said that's okay because we just want governments to stay out anyway, so we're not going to worry about that. But I think that era is over. And so I think that there's two fundamental areas where we do now need governments to catch up and move faster. The first is, call it the broader societal implications, and I think your questions and comments referred to that. the nature of work is changing, the nature of learning needs to change. As we think about the potential societal impact, the indirect effects of all of this, we need to prepare populations for the jobs of the future. We need to skill people up. And frankly, we need to make sure that access to technology is more ubiquitous, especially broadband, which is not nearly even as broadly distributed as the internet itself, which is only reaching the 50% point. And then there's the other question. As we imbue computers with artificial intelligence and fundamentally the ability to make decisions that have always been made by human beings, how do we think about the ethics of these questions? And how do we prevent a race to the bottom? I don't think that one can prevent a race to the bottom without some level of both government involvement in specific countries and perhaps even more importantly, a real level of international collaboration.
Do you think at this point, tech companies, I mean, we look at what's happened in the last couple of years, we've heard a lot of, we've heard the talk of artificial intelligence, jobs are going to go, what do we need to do? But we've also seen tech be weaponized in ways we've never seen before. Do you think at this point, tech companies are just too powerful?
I don't think that technology companies are too powerful, but I definitely think the era of tech companies thinking that it is good to move fast and break things is over.
But should they be broken up? I mean, you have Facebook, which owns WhatsApp, Instagram, Oculus. Do you think that the solution would be breaking them up?
I don't think that's a solution that is fundamentally going to address the issues that matter most. Whether you have one company or 3 companies or 30 companies or 300 companies, the real question isn't their size, but what they're doing, and how do we create the kind of environment where people are comfortable with what they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's great for me to be sitting alongside someone who's getting asked tougher questions than me, because normally it's not like that. But let me tell you how I'd approach it. I don't think it's that technology companies are too powerful. I don't think it's the right way to look at it. This technology is really powerful. The question is how you make its use accountable. And this is where the gap between the understanding that government and policymakers have and where they need to be in terms of understanding is large and dangerous, because if we make the wrong decisions on regulation, in the light of the way the world's developing, we're going to do ourselves damage. So, I always say to people, if you take the great post-war Labour Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, and if you put Clement Attlee back in London today, or in Britain, and he walked around and he experienced it, he'd think the world had changed. Every single aspect of what he remembered had changed, and then he'd go back into government and he'd feel completely at home. Okay, so the fact is, it's making sure that we have the systems of regulation that are sufficiently flexible, that they can deal with some of these big ethical questions. We need internationally to recognize there are certain issues like cybersecurity that can only properly ultimately be dealt with at an international level. And then I think there's a very specific issue, which is in the light of the enormous challenge that's going to come on technology from China, how does Europe and America stay aligned with each other, working with each other to make sure that we take the maximum benefit of this technology, but use it in a way that's consistent with our values. So this is, I think, these are the challenges that I see in the policy sphere. And I think, the way I think we should approach it from the public policy angle is to say the development of all this technology is basically good. I mean, it offers huge opportunities. And let's not forget the reason why these companies are big is because they're providing a service that consumers want. However, we also want to allow new companies to come through, so this is also important. We want to educate people as to how to use this. We want to make sure you don't end up with a digital inequity and inequality. And there are these major ethical questions that need to be dealt with. One of the things that Brad's been writing a lot about is facial recognition, for example. Okay, so plainly it has its uses, but it's got to be deployed with immense care because it's got massive ethical issues attached to it, as you can see from what's happening in China right now. So I think these are the things that we need to focus on, and we need to focus on them, I just think, with a much greater sense of collective and combined importance than we have up to now.
So let's focus on that. Facial recognition. Obviously, this is something coming down the pipeline. What do you think is the solution to regulate this? How, I know there's been a lot of debate in Silicon Valley over selling technology or working with the government. So how do you think it should be done?
Well, I think the first principle is that we believe that facial recognition needs to be subject to the rule of law and appropriate regulation. And we don't say that because we believe that about every form of information technology. We say it here because we believe the uses are so sensitive. There are clear benefits that come from facial recognition. We see it in ability to look at a phone and not have to use a password, or find photos and categorize them, or potentially find a missing child on a street. So there are good reasons to develop and deploy this technology. But there's a big but, because it can really change the world in which we live. In the private sector, it potentially means that every time you walk into a store, a retailer knows when you were there last, what good you picked up, what you purchased. If retailers share information, they know what store you just walked out of. And it's a legitimate question, I think, for citizens to ask, what does that mean? Am I comfortable with that? Am I really in control of my own privacy and information? But I think even that, frankly, pales in comparison to what it can do to the relationship between individuals and the state. Because for the first time, the world is on the threshold of technology that would give a government the ability to follow anyone, anywhere, and everyone, everywhere. It could know exactly where you are going, where you have been, and where you were yesterday as well. And this has profound potential ramifications for even just the fundamental civil liberties on which democratic societies rely. Before we wake up and find that the year 2024 looks like the book 1984, let's figure out what kind of world we want to create, and what are the safeguards, and what are the limitations on both companies and governments for the use of this technology.
Good thing. And I think part of that is holding some of these, these tech companies are more powerful than some countries at this point. You have Facebook as a digital nation of 2 billion people at this point. Part of the proposals, I read through some of the regulatory proposals that you guys had, is all about, giving sanctions to these companies for reckless behavior. So look at, now that technology has life or death implications. Look at Facebook, not getting on top of a disinformation campaigning that leading to death in Myanmar. Should Facebook have been sanctioned?
Yeah, I think you've got to have a regulatory system that recognizes the enormous power that these companies have, because as I say, it's the technology that's really powerful. They are the leaders in their field, and you're right, the big tech companies, have a market capital much greater than many countries, and their power to influence opinion means that, they can impact the debate that we're having. So I don't think there's a single political debate now that happens in the same way that it did even 5 years ago. And the opportunities for abuse in this situation are obvious. So what we're suggesting is, for the large companies, it's got to be regulated, and the regulators got to have the power to make sure that these companies don't abuse their position, that where, for example, you are dealing with these immensely sensitive issues around data and privacy, that we're finding a way to make sure that they operate in a way consistent with our values. But I don't think it's surprising that we have this challenge. And I think the important thing is to come out with a system of regulation that's sufficiently flexible and adaptable that it can, it comes up to date with the way that the technology is developing. Otherwise, you'll find very quickly your regulation's out of date. That's why I think it's also important that the Europeans and the Americans stay as aligned as possible on this issue of regulation, and do it in a way that allows these big companies, yes, to be sanctioned when they're abusing their position, but also, by the way, manages to create a playing field in which new competitors and new companies can develop, because this is also going to be important. And so I think, this is not surprising. This is like, the best way to think about this, I think, in political terms, is like the 19th century Industrial Revolution. I mean, it's that big a deal. And out of the 19th century Industrial Revolution came a whole series of legislations around health and safety, trade unions, and so on and so forth. Now, all of that developed out of the huge impact of the change. You're going to find the same with this technological revolution. We've just got to get it right. But we can only get it right if ultimately we have the right values operating at the heart of our regulatory system. And we're going to have to do this, by the way, knowing that as China's power develops, they are not going to approach this with the same restraints as we do here. And they're not going to have the same relationship between citizen and state that we have here. And this is why it's so important to get it right, because if the policymakers mess it up for reasons either of ignorance or prejudice, we're going to do ourselves immense damage in the long term.
And I think part of that is acknowledging that it's an issue, which we're seeing more of. I would say, Brad, in the United States, President Trump has downplayed Russia's role in influencing the election. Has the president's inability to acknowledge that this has been a big issue, has that impacted the industry's desire to address these issues?
Well, I actually think as an industry, the tech sector went through a watershed moment in August of this year. And I do think it's right to sort of step back and look at the threats to our democracies that are coming from particular nation states that in effect have turned tools into weapons and weaponized the internet. It's a huge problem. And I think generally, in most times in the past, when that kind of nation-state threat emerged, we would have looked for, let's say, the United States and the United Kingdom, together with other allies, to unite and push back. And one of the biggest problems, in my view, in this area over the last few years is that did not happen. And the particular reason it did not happen is really because within the US political system, both political parties really focused on what this meant as they looked in the rearview mirror at the 2016 election. They didn't want to come together because they were still arguing about the debate and the election that was behind them. Now, why was August a watershed moment? Well, it was a watershed moment for three reasons, and you saw all these things unfold in quick succession. First, the intelligence community and law enforcement agencies and their leaders in the administration did come together in a fairly unique press briefing that was at the White House, where they all were very public in offering attribution. And in so doing, they built on a prior attribution of the NotPetya attack that the White House staff had offered itself in February. Second, we at Microsoft came forward, and we did it on a very specific basis, that we had discovered attacks on two Republican-oriented think tanks, the International Republican Institute and the Hudson Institute. And we named names. We offered a public attribution. As it turned out, we did that on a Tuesday, and then Facebook acted on a Wednesday, and Google acted on a Thursday, and in almost every week since, you're seeing tech companies not only identify problems and say what they're doing, but they're being public. And so what I hope we are in the midst of is a unification of both the tech sector and Western Europe, certainly the United Kingdom and the United States, because I don't think we can even hope to be successful without that kind of unity.
I 100% agree with that. I mean, I think two things. First of all, where this interference is happening, and I think we should be frank, it is happening all over Europe right now, certainly, and in our electoral processes. We've got to call it out. If people are interfering in our democratic process, it's got to be exposed and dealt with, because otherwise you're not protecting your democracy. But the second thing is, this is just a point about it's the US, the UK, and I'm including the UK and Europe for these purposes for the moment, and hopefully forever. So, but if it...
What might change that?
Huh?
What might change that?
What might achieve that?
Change that. Why did you say hopefully?
Oh,
What's
that's
that
a whole
risk?
other argument, but I'm not...
But we can have
No,
it.
I'm not giving up on stopping Brexit until it actually happens. I'll all the way. But I mean, if you look, for example, at the development of the EU digital single market, right? That is something. I mean, obviously, Britain has a major interest in this, by the way, as a centre for the development of technology. But keeping the EU and the US aligned, I really think this is so important. Because if we are aligned together, we can start to deal with some of these problems together. And, I think we ignore the degree to which a large part, we take our value system for granted a lot of the time. But the truth is, the values that we believe in, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, Labour or Conservative, whatever you are, those values, which are about the democratic process, mean that when you come to technology and the regulation of technology, you come at it with a particular perspective. And you come at it also with a very vibrant debate around what is the right system of regulation. And all I'm saying is you've just got to factor in that a large part of the world is not living like that. And you are going to find that the 21st century is the first time in modern history where the Western system is going to be profoundly challenged. Now, that's not wrong in itself, but we need to be aware in the West that challenge is going to come principally from China. And I always say to people, I hope China evolves in a benign way. There's no doubt it's a different system of government, and it has made its pledge, 2025 vision, to attain superiority, particularly in the technology of artificial intelligence. Now, Brad will know much more than me whether this is attainable or not, but it's an ambition that it would be foolish for us to discount, and they are going to take the means, particularly in the use of data, to give their nascent companies a real opportunity to get ahead. So all I'm saying is when you look at that and realize all of these ethical issues are the same, frankly, in the US as they are this side of the water, we should be cooperating together. And we should cooperate together in the protection of our democracy and the enhancement of it, and in the recognition that this technology, in the end, can bring enormous benefits to us. And, I think the thing that, look, let me make a very open admission here, because I have a son who's got an education technology company, and his wife is in the technology business, and my children always say to me that I shouldn't talk about tech. They were very worried about me coming to this summit because they said you shouldn't talk about technology in public because we have a vast accumulated amount of evidence that you don't understand it. So I say there's a very great sense of humility, but this is the major issue politically of our time. If I was back in government today, I would literally be, and one of the things that drives me crazy about the Brexit thing is it's distractive, not just its destructive impact. This is the thing for policymakers to concentrate on, because this is what will determine whether we're successful in a way that preserves our values in the future.
Right. Speaking of, looking at the midterms, right? You guys were ahead of the curve. You found Russian hacking groups 3 months ago. You made it public. Other people followed suit. So we just had the midterms. They're still doing the count in the United States. Did you find anything else? Can you look at me and safely say the midterms were not compromised by these groups?
Well, the votes haven't even yet completely been tabulated, so it's clearly too early, I think, to draw the definitive conclusions. What we can say is three things. First, we know the problems that we found, and we disrupted those problems, and we believe we were successful so that those specific attacks didn't do damage.
But did you find any more after that?
We found some other things, not things I want to go into detail here, but really, no, what we certainly saw this effort, among other things, a real focus on hacking and continued efforts around disinformation. I think those two things were two trends we saw in 2016, and we saw them again in 2018. And there is still ongoing discussion and debate and even analysis on how to compare the 2 years in terms of the amount. But I say that there's two other things to note. We can talk about what we didn't see, all right? None of us have yet seen a profound calamity. But the third thing is perhaps the most important. You don't know what you don't know. And we did not understand in the United States the day after the election in 2016 everything that had unfolded in 2016. We didn't even really understand in early 2017 what had unfolded in 2016. So I think one needs to look at all of these things with both a determination to keep learning and looking, and frankly with some humility. I think that there's been some well-publicized humility across the tech sector, and the lesson is don't draw a definitive conclusion too quickly.
There is this current debate. I want to get into this because Microsoft recently bid for a contract to work with the Pentagon. There is a debate happening in Silicon Valley because much of this due to the current administration and the environment in America, where a lot of employees are protesting and saying they don't want their companies to go do business with the government. They don't trust it. Google recently was one of them. You have said we're not going to withdraw from the future. Google not playing ball. Do you think Google's withdrawing from the future?
What we have said, what I said is when companies stop working with a government, they sacrifice some of their ability to be engaged and have input on where the future goes. And so from our perspective, look, there are disagreements that we have. I think there's disagreements that everyone has every day with their government and many governments. And of course, some disagreements rise to a whole nother level, as the world saw in the 1930s. But what we do say today, and we say it very comfortably, is that when we look at the democratic republics of the world, the United States, Canada, Western Europe, Japan, these are governments that we want to work with. These are governments we are going to supply technology to. But they are also governments where we are going to be not only active but proactive. We will use our voice, we will use our role as corporate citizens, we will share information about where technology is going, and we will offer our point of view on what we think the right path is for governments. And we know at the end of the day we're one voice, but we believe we will have a much greater and more positive impact by doing that than by saying, you know what, we're not going to engage in providing governments with this technology.
When it comes to this, where would you draw the line ethically? You, Brad Smith of Microsoft, where would you guys draw the line when it comes to these types of services?
Well, there are many lines, and we draw them all the day and every day, and it's so important to know what lines you're prepared to draw. And I think one more than ever, and in many ways that you've heard here, we do have to think about the values that unite us. We need to think about values and a commitment to human rights that the governments in the last century were prepared to say were universal, that made their way into a global recognition of human rights. So what does that mean? It means that we have huge decisions that we make about when and when not we will put data centers in particular countries, what services we'll put in those data centers, what customers will serve. And there's an important dimension to this. We cannot put people's human rights at risk by putting their data in a country where people can be persecuted or prosecuted or potentially even killed if that goes too far. There are also particular uses of technology like facial recognition that are so sensitive that there are times that we must say no, as we've been doing this year. There have been contracts that we have walked away from because we just felt that the customer was not one in a particular country that would respect human rights, or because the technology was so immature that it would be used in a way that would be biased and detrimental in terms of the protection of people's freedoms.
So could you give us a specific, would you guys provide artificial intelligence services to China, or would you provide products to the People's Liberation Army? Is that something you guys would consider, or is that where you draw the line?
Well, I just think that in the world of technology, it is a mistake to think that all technology, even in artificial intelligence, is created equal. AI is such a broad term. There's so many uses of it. Just think about the fact that basically since 1985, Microsoft has sold a product around the world called Microsoft Word. People have written wonderful works of literature, and I'm sure other people have done horrible things in terms of what they have written. We have not tried to police what people write. I think it would be a bad outcome for the world if we did. I think we have to say there are certain categories of technology that fall into one bucket. There are other categories of technology that are at a whole different level. And when it comes to the storage of people's data, their most personal information, when it comes to something like artificial intelligence and other categories as well, we need to be sophisticated enough to have a common set of values, but a differential approach.
Was that a yes or a no?
We have never turned down any customer that wanted to buy Microsoft Word if they were in a country that the United States government allowed us to sell the product. So I'm sure that there are people who work in the Chinese military that use Microsoft Word, and every day we hope they'll pay us for it.
Great. I want to give you the last word. Do you think, are you optimistic? You've talked about this disconnect between government and the tech sector. Do you think we need a separate regulatory body where we pull from the tech sector? Or do you think that, that the government is equipped to understand some of these issues?
I don't think the governments are yet equipped to understand them, but I think they need to be. But I look at this as a policymaker from this perspective. The development of the technology over the past 20, 30 years and for the next 20, 30 years offers us enormous opportunities, but its impact is vast, and plainly it can also have a major downside to it. But I come at it from the idea technology is basically liberating and not something we should fear. Secondly, because of its pervasiveness, because of its ability to impact people's lives, there needs to be a proper system of regulation. This should be worked out, in my view, in alliance and in partnership with the technology industry, not in a sense of hostility, but in a sense of understanding that the public interest has to be represented, and that should be done with sensible regulation. And thirdly, because we are in a race on this technology for the 21st century, Europe and America, as I said before, should stay together. So I think the key thing is to establish those principles from which we come at this issue from a public policy perspective. And then I would just end with this plea that it really is necessary for those in the tech world, and not just the big companies, but others, to educate the policymakers as to what this means, how it's best dealt with, and how we look at these issues today. Because if it is as revolutionary as I think, then in my view, quite apart from everything else, the first group of politicians that really understand this revolution can grasp its opportunities, mitigate its risks, and can weave this revolution into a narrative about the future that is optimistic, because basically the Western politics today is governed by pessimism. The first group of politicians to seize that opportunity and to create that narrative will be the ones that own the future of politics, and we should get on with it and start.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.